Quietly nestled in the Catskill Mountains is St. Joseph's Novitiate. This past summer, however, the convent was tossed from its normal tranquility into a sea of controversy by the kidnapping of a young novice, Sister Mary Cecilia. What distinguished this fact was that the novice was kidnapped by her own family. The kidnappers subsequently charged that the convent's spiritual director, the Reverend Clarence Kelly, was running a cult, and that he bore similarities to cult guru Jim Jones. However, a reporter from Fox News, after spending nearly 1 week at the convent, said the convent was not a cult. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. St. Joseph's is different from other convents in that its sisters practice the pre-Vatican II Catholic religion, full-length habits, Latin Mass, recollectedness. The kidnapping was covered in feature articles by all major U.S. newspapers and culminated in an appearance on the Phil Donahue Show by the Reverend Clarence Kelly and his colleague, Father William Jenkins. Today we have with us Father Clarence Kelly to discuss the kidnapping at St. Joseph's. Father Kelly, welcome to What Catholics Believe.
It's a pleasure to be here, Julius.
Father Kelly, did anyone ever tell you that you don't resemble Phil Donahue?
No, you're the first one.
Well, the reason I laugh is that your colleague, Father William Jenkins, bore a striking physical resemblance to a young Phil Donahue and was even remarked about that fact. Before we get into the controversial aspects of this story, perhaps you could tell us about St. Joseph's Novitiate. What is St. Joseph's Novitiate and why does it exist?
St. Joseph's Novitiate is a traditional convent where young women are trained according to the pre-Vatican II norms of religious life. It is a 3-year program of training. When they enter, they are what are called postulants, and their postulancy lasts for about 10 months. At the end of the postulancy, they then petition to be accepted into the novitiate, and the novitiate is a 2-year period of intense spiritual training, again according to the norms which prevailed before the Second Vatican Council, and according to the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales, St. John of the Cross, and St. Teresa of Avila. Mm-hmm. At the end of the 2-year novitiate, if they go on, they will then profess what are called simple vows for a period of 1 year. Those are the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. At the end of that 1-year period, they renew the vows. The following year, they renew again. And then finally, they renew for a 3-year period. At the end of that 3-year period, if they choose to, they would then take perpetual vows. And if they take perpetual vows, then they have made what is a lifetime commitment. So the whole program, before they actually make this lifetime commitment, is just under 9 years. And the reason for that is to ensure that what they do with absolute liberty.
Mm-hmm. Father Kelly, one of the charges that was made against you on the Phil Donahue Show was that you are not under the local bishop. Is this true?
Yes, it is true.
Well, why aren't you under the local bishop?
Well,
isn't this disobedient?
The answer to the question is the same answer that I gave on that show, and it is that the local bishop, the Bishop of Albany, belongs to a different religion.
How is this? I mean, isn't he a Catholic in union with John Paul II?
Well, I grant you that there is some confusion here, because if you were to ask him, are you the Catholic Bishop of Albany, he would say, well, of course I am. And if you were to ask me, Father Kelly, are you a Catholic priest, I'd say, well, of course I am. So we have 2 people claiming to be Catholics. But in order to solve the mystery, what you have to do is you have to find out, what is it to be a Catholic? What constitutes the Catholic religion? And then see which of us, the Bishop of Albany or myself, and the priest that I'm associated with, and of course the sisters, which one actually practices that Catholic faith. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to determine what is required to be a Catholic. There are fundamentally 3 standards by which to judge, and they are the worship that you practice, the doctrine that you believe and the moral standard that you follow. And our worship, our form of worship, is the Catholic Mass as it has been given to us by the Church down through the centuries. The moral standard that we follow is the traditional Catholic moral standard. We adhere to the identical moral code, for example, that Pope Pius XII adhered to, or Gregory XVI or Pius IX. And the doctrines that we hold, that is to say the beliefs that are solemn and sacred and by which we govern our lives, those doctrines are identical to the doctrines that Catholics have always believed. Now, if you apply that standard to the Bishop of Albany, you would find a major problem. And the major problem is that he does not practice Catholic worship. He practices a new form of worship that is of relatively recent composition. His standard of morality is different. It's more of a relativistic standard. And the doctrines that he adheres to and that the priest and the people of the diocese adhere to also is a kind of system of belief which varies from person to person, priest to priest, parish to parish.
Father, what exactly happened? Many people have expressed their views on what happened. They said what you were supposedly doing. What's your view? I mean, we should give you an opportunity to explain what exactly happened.
With regard to the kidnapping,
the whole situation, yes.
Well, it was a Sunday afternoon, June the 26th, a bright Sunday afternoon. I was away from the Novitiate for the afternoon because after I say Mass there in the morning, I go south about 65 miles to say Mass at a chapel by the name of Maria Regina in Wappingers Falls. And I made the trek to Maria Regina, said Mass, and returned. When I returned to the Novitiate, I pulled into the driveway, and one of the sisters came running up to me and said, "They took her, they took her." And I wasn't sure what she was referring to. She was very excited. I discovered momentarily that the Grieve family from Cincinnati, Ohio, had kidnapped their daughter, Sister Mary Cecilia.
Now, I understand that this is not the first time they actually kidnapped her, but they, by force or coercion or trickery, took her once before.
They did. Mrs. Grieve visited St. Joseph's Novitiate the week after Easter this year, 1988, and she tricked Sister Mary Cecilia to getting into her car, and once she had her in the car, she drove off. The nature of this kidnapping is substantially different in the sense that it was a very violent affair.
Well, what exactly happened at this kidnapping?
Well, Sister Mary Cecilia was out for a walk, a Sunday afternoon walk with two other sisters, Sister Marie Therese, who teaches at St. Pius V School on Long Island, and Sister Mary Elizabeth, also who teaches there. They were up for the week, visiting St. Joseph's. They were out for a Sunday afternoon walk. They walked down Heart's Content Road in a northerly direction. They crossed over a little bridge. They returned and passed the driveway of a neighbor. And just as they passed the driveway, a car moving in a northerly direction stopped in the middle of the road. They turned and looked at the car, and in the car was Mr. James Grieve, a Cincinnati fireman, and three of his sons, John Grieve, David Grieve, and Mark Grieve. David Grieve and John Grieve were sitting in the back seat of the car. David Grieve got out, left the door of the car open, and walked over to the sisters who were on the other side of the street. And he began to speak to them, and as they spoke, they began to walk toward the driveway of this house, and the car followed them with the door open. They were all ready. They then, Mr. James Grieve, the Cincinnati fireman, pulled into the driveway, and Sister Mary Cecilia went over to him and spoke to him. Now, this is a most unusual kidnapping because it turned out that all total there were actually 8 witnesses to it.
8 witnesses.
8 witnesses. Sitting on the stoop of the house of this driveway was a man by the name of Herbert Schwanze, who was a police lieutenant from New Jersey. He was visiting his mother. That was his mother's house. Also present were his wife, his mother, and a friend of the family. He looked up and he saw the car pull in. He saw the sister speaking to this man who got out of the car, and he presumed that they knew each other, and so he was reading a book or a paper, and he began again to read. What happened was David Grieve tried to talk Sister Mary Cecilia into getting into the car. Sister Mary Cecilia refused. She turned to head back to the Novitiate property. David Grieve grabbed her. He's a fairly big, he also, by the way, is a Cincinnati fireman. He was a wrestler as well. He grabbed his sister, who was 5'2", literally lifted her from the ground, swung her around, tried to force her into the car. She refused. She fought back. She held on to the edge of the car, and she was screaming and yelling. She was screaming out, "No, no, not again, not again," because of the kidnapping that had taken place the week after Easter. David Grieve pushed her forcefully into the car. He missed the car, and her head smashed against the roof of the car so forcefully that it actually bounced forward. And he did this not once, but 2, possibly 3 or 4 times. She later on told someone that she had knots on her head as a result of that. He then threw her into the car. John Grieve, her 16-year-old brother, who was in the car, pulled her in. She fell to the floor of the car, and David Grieve jumped in. One of the witnesses said it appeared as though he was sitting on top of her. Her feet were up in the air. The police lieutenant, who was sitting on the porch of the house, heard her head and her screams, heard her head smash against the roof of the car. He got up, he ran down to try and stop the kidnapping, but they sped off again in a northerly direction. Just as this happened, a pickup truck came on the scene, saw what happened, and chased them up Heart's Content Road out to a major thoroughfare about 4 miles chase. He told the policeman, this Herbert Schwanze, that they were traveling at about 60 to 65 miles an hour down these very narrow, winding, dangerous roads, putting everybody's life in jeopardy. Very strange behavior, in my opinion, for 2 public employees of Cincinnati, both of them firemen. He chased them out to a main thoroughfare, gave up the chase because he had his wife in the car and he was afraid for her safety. And then he went back to the scene of the kidnapping.
Now this seems like a very extreme event. The newspaper reports I read were that this nun disappeared for a while and no one knew where she was. In other words, she just didn't suddenly surface. And in fact, for several days, there were newspaper reports about the kidnapping. No one knew where the family was. They had suspicions. What happened after this?
Well, they had it very well planned. And indeed, we know from public confessions that they actually planned it for 3 weeks. And as the facts begin to come out, it appears that the Archdiocese of New York, through one of its officials, may have had a hand in the kidnapping.
Was this, by any chance, Father James Labar?
That's correct. Father James Labar, who is the official spokesman for the Archdiocese of New York, and hence the official spokesman for Cardinal O'Connor. He was consulted by the Grieve family before the kidnapping and after the kidnapping. And I know from affidavits that I have involving other kidnappings that the kidnappers actually consulted this priest of the Archdiocese in the course of the kidnapping before the victim was released.
Huh.
So one can draw the obvious conclusion, which is that Father Labar did not discourage them from the kidnapping and very well may have had a very strong hand in it.
Well, my question would be, why was he involved in this kidnapping? He must have been very concerned about St. Joseph's Novitiate.
Well, he would be very concerned because Father Labar is an official of the Conciliar Church, of the of the Archdiocese of New York, and they are vehemently opposed to our religious convictions, because we are saying to them that since the Vatican Council, they have done some very bad things to the Church, and that out of fidelity to the Church and to our Lord and Savior, they should renounce these things they have done because of the tremendous destruction it has wrought. And so they would look upon us in a very negative way. There's no question about that.
It seems that the plot actually thickens after the kidnapping. The actual physical event was just the beginning. There was charges made that a professional deprogrammer was hired who is still anonymous, and this novice, Sister Mary Cecilia, was taken to a cabin in Pennsylvania where she spent 1 week, I believe, under coercion. She was not free to leave with this deprogrammer. What exactly happened there?
Well, it's very clear that they had some very professional advice, because the kidnapping went off in a very professional way. The car used in the kidnapping was a rented vehicle. It was rented at Albany Airport. The Grieve family had waiting a getaway van, and this getaway van, by the way, had tinted glass, and Mrs. Grieve on national television boasted about the fact that they had planned it that way, quite obviously fearful that Sister Mary Cecilia would put up a ruckus and she would not be seen through the tinted glass. So what they did was they drove to this prearranged spot. They transferred Sister Mary Cecilia from the kidnapped vehicle to the getaway vehicle. They then took the kidnapped vehicle back to Albany Airport. The policeman who saw the kidnapping got the license plate of that vehicle. And so the state police went to Albany Airport to intercept the kidnapped vehicle. And they did, in fact, find James Grieve, John Grieve, and another man. Meanwhile, the Grieve family in this van, borrowed from a family in Cincinnati, Ohio, they then drove south, probably on the New York State Thruway, to Route 84, and then 84 west into Pennsylvania to a place called Milford, Pennsylvania. They had a cabin there, and the following day, this woman, whose name we know is Mary, she arrived in order to destroy the religious convictions of Sister Mary Cecilia for money. She was paid a large sum of money to attack the religious convictions of this young novice, in addition to the fact that she also herself is a conciliar or Novus Ordo Catholic, and therefore she would have great animosity toward our religious convictions, as would this Father Labar of the Archdiocese of New York.
When this, what I recall is that after this whole series of events, this nun did not come back to St. Joseph's Novitiate, but at first she seemed to be pretty adamant about her vocation and was very distressed after the first kidnapping and thought her parents didn't do a very good thing. However, there seems to have come over a great change. Now, my question is, did she have such a commitment to this in the first place? Why the change in her?
Well, I don't know if Sister Mary Cecilia is the type of person out of which martyrs are made. I don't know about that. But I do know that she was at St. Joseph's Novitiate because she wanted to be there. How do I know that? I know it because she wrote to me. I have a letter from her, in fact, that she wrote to me April the 1st, 1986. I didn't even know her. I didn't know her. And in this letter, she tells me that she is a 6th grade teacher at St. Gertrude's Academy, that she is interested in the religious life. She is not sure whether she should do 2 more years of college or she should pursue her religious vocation. And she ends the letter by saying, I only want to do what God wants me to do. I am a little worried because it may take some doing to get both my parents behind me. I ask your advice, Father. And so I wrote to her, and the response that I got to her letter was the reception of this application. She sent this application to St. Joseph's Novitiate. It's a standard application, but it is very significant with regard to the charges that have been leveled against the novitiate, because one of the questions that we ask those who are applying to the novitiate is this: are you applying of your own free will without being forced in any way whatsoever? That's a question that we ask them before they come. And then at the very end of the application, this is what they have to attest to. They have to say, I hereby declare before Almighty God that all the information contained herein is true to the best of my knowledge. And I have the application signed by Mary Susan Grieve. About 10 months later, that is to say after she came to St. Joseph's Novitiate, she requested to be accepted as a novice. And again, she has to sign a document testifying under oath that she is asking this of her own free will without being forced in any way. There's no question that she wanted to be there.
Okay, given the seriousness of what occurred with the kidnapping, surely the parents had a very serious reason for doing what they're doing. And one of the things they said is that you followed no one, you were your own rule, and that you didn't follow traditional Catholic principles in running this convent, that you, for instance, inspected mail. How would you respond to this?
I'd respond by saying that my understanding of what a cult is that it basically is a system whereby people govern their behavior and they fashion their ideals according to a particular individual, a kind of rule by man rather than a rule by law. And that is not the case in a traditional Catholic order or congregation where everything is governed very strictly by a written law and everybody is bound to that law. And so the sisters at St. Joseph's Novitiate have a rule, which is the rule of St. Augustine, and they also have a set of constitutions, which is about 168 pages long, and it governs every facet of the life of a religious, and everybody is bound by it. The novices are bound by it, the professed religious are bound by it, and so are the superiors. As far as the question of the mail goes, there's no difference whatsoever between the practice at St. Joseph's Novitiate and the practice in religious congregations down through the ages. There is a question of privacy, and the privacy with regard to mail is certainly respected. However, it is true that in traditional religious congregations, the superiors had a right to have the mail pass through their hands, and they did have a right to read it.
In other words, this isn't something that was started at St. Joseph's. This has been around for 1,000 years, perhaps.
Well, Canon 611 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law is the canon which governs this. But there's a very, very good reason for it, by the way. And the good reason is this, that when someone professes vows in a religious congregation, there is created a bilateral contract. There is a contract between the congregation and the person who is professing vows. Both of them have rights and both have obligations. And the nature of a religious congregation is such that it is very, very important not to allow into the congregation those who do not have the religious spirit, or those who would bring in the spirit of the world. And so when someone comes to religious life, they know exactly what it is, exactly what they're getting into, exactly what the rules are. And these are simply the traditional rules for a religious congregation.
The charges, I believe, were made that some of the sisters were actually kept at St. Joseph's against their will. Would you respond to this?
I would say that it is both a slander from the point of view of civil law and a calumny from the point of view of moral law. In other words, it's a bold-faced lie. It's absolutely untrue. The whole system in the traditional setup of religious congregation is to ensure liberty. In fact, in the case of Sister Mary Cecilia, because of the troubles from her family, she had to assure us even more than the average novice would that she wanted to be there and that she was there of her own free will, because the Grieve family was threatening various types of lawsuits. And I called her in and I explained that to her. I said it could be an ugly type thing, and it might even be a question where you will have to testify assuring everyone that you are there of your own free will. She said she wanted to do that because she believed that she had a vocation. She even told an attorney that, by the way.
Huh. The Grieve family, it seems that their main concern or their justification for doing this was that there were irregularities at the convent and so on and so forth. It also seems, though, that Mrs. Grieve did not think. In fact, her brother said in national newspapers that his sister was too pretty to be a nun. What role did this play?
Well, in my estimation of it, the real reason for the opposition of Mrs. Grieve is, and this is my opinion, that she has a kind of insane desire to rule the life of her daughter. And that's my opinion of what is at the root of this. She has expressed on a number of occasions to a number of people that she considered her daughter's entrance into the convent something akin to her death. How could God take this daughter since he took another daughter? She had another daughter that died either in childbirth or at a very young age, and she has actually said to people, how could God take this one too?
Mm-hmm. It seems that this kind of kidnapping, although it's spectacular, is nothing new, because wasn't St. Thomas Aquinas himself kidnapped by his brothers when he wanted to become a Dominican?
Not only was St. Thomas Aquinas kidnapped, but also St. John of the Cross was kidnapped.
Father
He was kidnapped by religious.
We're running out of time. We'll be back next time to continue our discussion.